It's 9:30, so I'm just going to jump right into this today. Chapter 6, A Zero-Sum Game. I woke up to the sound of Dad's laughter. I had no sense of time. My room was very dark, and the hallway light glared bright and incongruous under my door. I slipped out of bed. I was 2.5, and my 5-year-old brother was sleeping far away on the opposite end of the apartment. I went alone to see what was going on. My parents' room was next to mine, and its door was standing wide open. All of the lights were on. I stopped at the threshold. Dad had his back to the chest of drawers, and Mom, sitting on the bed directly across from him, was leaning away, one hand held up, the other supporting her weight on the mattress. I didn't immediately know what I was looking at. Dad was aiming a rifle at her, the .22 he kept on his boat to shoot sharks, and he kept laughing. Mom begged him to stop. He raised the gun until it was pointing at her face. She lifted her arm higher and screamed again, more loudly. Dad seemed to find it funny. I turned and ran back to bed. My mother corralled my brother and me into the car and took us to a friend's house for the night. Eventually, my father tracked us down. He barely remembered what he'd done, but he promised my mother it would never happen again. He was waiting for us when we returned to the apartment the next day, and they agreed to try and work things out. But they kept going through the motions of their day-to-day lives without acknowledging the problems in their marriage. Nothing was going to get better. Things weren't even going to stay the same. Less than 2 miles away, in another one of my grandfather's buildings, Mary Ann was in trouble. Her husband, David, had lost his Jaguar dealership a couple of years earlier and still didn't have a job. Anybody who was paying attention would have realized that all was not well, but Mary Ann's siblings and their friends thought David Desmond was a joke, rotund and harmless. Freddie had never understood the marriage or taken his brother-in-law seriously. Mary Ann had been 22 when she had met David, a graduate student at Columbia studying public policy. She had planned to get a PhD, but, wanting to avoid the shame of being called an old maid by her family, Freddie included, she had accepted David's proposal and dropped out of school after getting her master's degree. The initial problem was that David, a Catholic, insisted that Mary Ann convert. Not wanting to provoke her father's anger or hurt her mother's feelings, she was terrified to ask for their blessing. When she finally did, Fred said, "Do whatever you want." She explained how very, very sorry she was to disappoint them. "Mary Ann, I couldn't care less. You're going to be his wife." Gam didn't say anything at all, and that was that. David liked to tell Mary Ann that his name would be known far beyond the reach of the Trumps. Although well-educated, he didn't have any obvious skills to back up his ambition. Even so, he remained convinced that he'd find a way to succeed beyond his dreams and show them, like Ralph Cramden, without the charm, kindness, or steady job with benefits, his next big thing, just like the car dealership, always failed or never materialized at all. It wasn't long into the marriage before David started drinking. The Desmonds lived rent-free in a Trump apartment and enjoyed the same medical insurance everyone in the family received through Trump management. But free rent and medical insurance didn't put food on the table, and they had no income. The biggest mystery, however, was why Mary Ann was so financially dependent on her incompetent husband, just as it was a mystery that Elizabeth lived in a gloomy one-bedroom apartment next to the 59th Street Bridge, and Freddie couldn't buy a house with his planes, boats, and luxury cars. Hey, an acknowledgement. My grandfather and great-grandmother had set up trust funds for all of Fred's children in the 1940s. Whether or not Mary Ann was entitled to the principal yet, the trusts must have generated interest. But the 3 oldest children had been trained not to ask for anything ever, and if my grandfather was the trustee of those trusts, they were trapped in their financial circumstances. Asking for help meant you were weak or greedy, or seeking advantage over someone who needed nothing from you in return, although an exception was made for Donald. It was so frowned upon that Mary Ann, Freddie, and Elizabeth, in different ways, all suffered from totally avoidable deprivation. After a few years of her husband's continued unemployment, Mary Ann was at the end of her rope. She approached her mother, but in a way that didn't arouse suspicion. "Mom, I need some change for the laundry," she would say casually whenever she went to the house. She thought nobody knew how bad it was. For Fred, once his daughter was married, she wasn't his concern, but my grandmother knew. She didn't ask questions either, because she didn't want to pry or because she wanted Marianne to have her pride, and handed her daughter a Crisco can filled with dimes and quarters that came from the washers and dryers that she'd retrieved from my grandfather's building. Every few days, Gam made the rounds in Brooklyn and Queens, driving her pink Cadillac convertible and wearing her fox fur stole to collect the coins. As my aunt would later concede, in a family of already tremendous wealth, those Crisco cans saved her life. Without them, she wouldn't have been able to feed herself or her son, David Jr. At the very least, Marianne should have been able to buy groceries without having to ask my grandmother, no matter how obliquely. But no matter how dire their situation, the 3 oldest Trump children couldn't get anybody in the family to help them with any subsistence. After a while, there seemed to be no point in trying at all. Elizabeth simply accepted her lot. Dad eventually came to believe it was what he deserved. Marianne convinced herself that not asking for or receiving help was a badge of honor. Their fear of my grandfather was so deeply ingrained that they no longer even recognized it for what it was. The situation with David Desmond eventually became untenable. He couldn't get a job, and his drinking worsened. Desperate, but being very careful not to seem as if she were asking for anything, Marianne hinted to her father that David would love a place at Trump Management. My grandfather didn't ask if there was a problem. He gave his son-in-law a job as a parking lot attendant at one of the buildings in Jamaica Estates. Donald graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in the spring of 1968 and went straight to work at Trump Management. From his first day on the job, my 22-year-old uncle was given more respect and perks and paid more money than my father ever had been. Almost immediately, my grandfather appointed Donald vice president of several companies that fell under the Trump Management umbrella, named him manager of a building he didn't actually have to manage, gave him consulting fees, and hired him as a banker. The reasoning for this was twofold. First, it was an easy way to put Freddie in his place while signaling to the other employees that they were expected to defer to Donald. Second, it helped consolidate Donald's de facto position as heir apparent. Donald secured his father's attention in a way nobody else could, or did. None of Freddie's friends could understand why Donald was, in Fred's eyes, the cat's meow. But after the summers and weekends Donald spent working for his father and visiting construction sites, Fred exposed his younger son to the ins and outs of the real estate business. Donald discovered he had a taste for the seamier, S-E-A-M-I-E-R, seamier side of dealing with contractors and navigating the political and financial power structures that undergirded the world of New York City real estate. Father and son could discuss the business and local politics and gossip endlessly, even if the rest of us in the cheap seats had no idea what they were talking about. Not only did Fred and Donald share traits and dislikes, they had the ease of equals, something Freddie could never achieve with his father. Freddie had a wider view of the world than his brother or his father did. Unlike Donald, he had belonged to organizations and groups in college that had exposed him to other people's points of view. In the National Guard and as a pilot at TWA, he had been the best and brightest career professionals who believed there was a greater good, that there were more things than just money, such as expertise, dedication, loyalty. They understood that life wasn't a zero-sum game, but that was part of my dad's problem. Donald was as narrow and provincial and egotistical as their father, but he also had a confidence and brazenness that Fred envied and his older brother lacked, qualities that Fred planned to turn to his advantage. Donald's bid to replace my father at Trump Management was off to a strong start, but he was still at loose ends at home. Robert was at Boston University, which enabled him to avoid service in Vietnam, and Donald and Elizabeth didn't socialize with each other. Freddie did his best to include his little brother in whatever he and his friends got up to, but it rarely went well. They were a laid-back group who loved flying out east with Freddie to fish and water ski. They found Donald's lack of humor and self-importance off-putting. Though they tried for Freddie's sake to welcome his little brother, they didn't like him. Toward the end of Donald's first year at Trump Management, the tensions between him and Freddie were becoming noticeable. Though Freddie tried to leave it at the office, Donald could never let anything go. Despite that, when Billy Drake's girlfriend Anna Maria was having a dinner party, Freddie asked if he could invite his brother. The evening didn't go much better than Donald's attempted flirtation in the driveway years earlier. Shortly after the brothers arrived, raised voices drew Anna Maria from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. She found Donald standing inches away from his brother, flushed and pointing his finger in Freddie's face. Donald looked as though he were about to hit Freddie, so Anna Maria pushed herself between the two very tall men. Freddie took a step back and said through his clenched teeth, "Donald, get out of here." Donald seemed stunned, then stormed away, saying, "Fine, you eat the girl's roast beef," as he slammed the door on his way out. "Idiot," Anna Maria called after him. She turned back to Freddie and asked, "What was that all about?" Shaken, Freddie simply said work stuff, and they left it at that. Things weren't getting any better at the Highlander either. Despite my mother's fear of snakes, Dad brought home a ball python one day and put the tank into the den, forcing my mother to pass it by any time she needed to do laundry, go into my brother's room, or leave the apartment. Their fights escalated after that gratuitous bit of cruelty, and by 1970, my mother had had all she could take. She asked Dad to leave. When he came back unannounced a couple of weeks later and let himself in, she called my grandfather and insisted that the locks be changed. For once, Fred didn't object. He didn't ask any questions, and he didn't blame her. He simply told her that he would take care of it, and he did. And Dad never lived with us again. My mother called Matthew Totsi, one of my grandfather's attorneys, to tell him she wanted a divorce. Mr. Tosti, T-O-S-T-I, Tosti, and his partner, Erwin Durbin, had been doing work for my grandfather since the 1950s. Even before my parents separated, Mr. Tosti had been my mother's main contact for anything having to do with me, my brother, or money. He became her confidant. In the bleak landscape of the Trump family, he stood out as a warm and supportive ally, and he considered himself a friend. As genuinely kind as Mr. Tosti may have been, he also knew on which side his bread was buttered. Despite the fact that my mother had her own counsel, the divorce agreements might as well have been dictated by my grandfather. He knew that his daughter-in-law had no idea how much money my father's family had or what his future prospects, as the son of an exceedingly wealthy man, might be. My mother received $100 a week in alimony plus $50 a week for child support. At the time, those weren't insignificant sums, especially considering that the biggest expense, such as schools, camp tuition, and medical insurance, were taken care of separately. My father was also responsible for paying the rent. Because my grandfather owned the building we lived in, it was only $90 a month. I learned many years later that my brother and I each owned 10% of the Highlander, so in retrospect, charging us rent at all seemed excessive. Dad's rent obligation was capped at $250, which limited our ability to move if we ever wanted to relocate to a better apartment or neighborhood. My father, the scion of a family that at the time was worth well over $100 million, agreed to pay for private school and college. But Mr. Tosti had to approve our vacations. There was no marital assets to split, so my mother's total worth was the $600 she got every month, an amount that would change over the next decade. After expenses, there was barely enough left over for Mom to contribute to our animal. I am butchering this, guys. I am so sorry. There were no marital assets to split, so my mother's total net worth was $600 that she got every month, an amount that wouldn't change over the next decade. After expenses, there was barely enough left over for Mom to contribute to her annual Christmas fund, let alone save up to buy a house. My mother got full custody of me and my brother, as was customary at the time, but visitation rights weren't specified. Mr. Trump shall be free to see the children on reasonable notice and at reasonable times. In the vast majority of cases, visitation meant having the kids every other weekend and one night a week for dinner. That's eventually what my parents' arrangement evolved into, but at the beginning, there were no formal rules. The steeplechase development was permanently blocked in 1969, but eventually the city purchased the land back from my grandfather. He walked away with $1.3 million in profit for having done nothing but ruin a beloved city landmark. My dad was left nothing but blame. All right. That is all. Given that it's telling me that the next chapter is going to take about 41 minutes to read in total, it seems fair to say that chapter 7 will probably be split into 2, possibly even 3 parts. But that said, good night, guys. Thanks for sticking the course with me here. And I will see you tomorrow. Stay sane and avoid the news. Peace out.